Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Russian economy right now, and to talk about another shock decision that's been taken by the Bank of Russia. But before we get into that, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button? It only takes a second and it really does help me with the algorithm and puts a smile on my face. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that we've talked a lot about Russia over the last few years. And one of the biggest issues that Russia has been dealing with since the start of the war in Ukraine is inflation. Inflation has been persistently high, it's been volatile, and crucially, it's been well above the level that the central bank in Russia is targeting. The official target rate is 4%, which is actually around double what we're seeing in most other countries. It's 2% in the UK and the USA, which is considered normal. But in Russia, 4% is the benchmark because structurally the economy just isn't stable enough to consistently achieve 2%. There's more volatility, more shocks, and therefore a higher baseline is accepted by the central bank. However, even by Russian standards, inflation has been running at far too high levels. If we go back 12 months to March 2025, inflation was sitting at 10.3%, which was the highest that had been seen for 2 years. Now, over the last 12 months, things have improved, with inflation coming down to 5.6% in December, so still above the target level, but it was moving in the right direction. But that improvement hasn't held. In January, inflation ticked back up to 6%, and the latest data for February shows that it's now sitting at 5.9%. So we're still running roughly 50% above the Bank of Russia's target of 4%. And that's where things start to get interesting, because if you follow basic economic theory, the response to this is obvious. If inflation is too high, you raise interest rates. Higher interest rates increase the cost of borrowing, reduce demand because nobody wants to take on the debt, so they don't have as much cash to spend. Therefore, it slows spending and ultimately brings inflation back down. There's a calming in prices if you get a reduction in demand. And that's exactly what we've seen from central banks across the world over the last few years. But Russia is now doing the opposite. Instead of raising interest rates, the Bank of Russia has been cutting them. And this latest move is another step in that direction, because in March, the Bank of Russia reduced interest rates further to 15%. Now, to understand why they did that at a time when inflation is still well above its target rate, we need to look at what's happened since the start of the war in Ukraine. Immediately after the invasion of Ukraine, the Bank of Russia took emergency action and raised interest rates to 20%. They were calling that an emergency rate. That was designed to stabilise the system, support the RUBLE, and stop capital flight, people taking their money out of the country. But that level of 20% couldn't be sustained, so rates were quickly brought back down to around 7.5% by the end of 2022. However, that easing contributed to inflation because it reduced the cost of borrowing, and so people started borrowing again, spending, and so spending went up, demand went up, and therefore prices started going up. So during 2023 and into 2024, the Bank of Russia reversed course and started pushing interest rates all the way up to a record 21%, which is extremely high by global standards. But over the last 12 months, we've seen a clear shift. Rates have been coming down, and this latest cut really reinforces that trend. Now, the obvious question is, why is the Bank of Russia doing this? Why cut rates when inflation is still significantly above your target level? And the answer comes down to growth. Because while inflation is still a problem, the Russian economy is now starting to slow quite significantly. If we look at GDP, Russia actually posted strong growth in 2023 and 2024. Both years it was above 4%. But that growth was heavily driven by government spending, particularly military spending. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that Russia basically converted itself into being a wartime economy, with lots of companies being sponsored directly by the Kremlin to produce things for the war efforts in Ukraine. So it wasn't broad, sustainable economic expansion. And now we're starting to see the consequences of those years of that switch to a wartime economy. Because in 2025, growth dropped sharply to 1%. Now that is a major slowdown from 2 years of 4% growth. So what the Bank of Russia appears to be doing now is shifting priorities. Instead of focusing purely on inflation, it's now trying to support economic growth. Lower interest rates make borrowing cheaper, encourage spending, and can help stimulate the economy. But this is where Russia is now stuck. It's caught between two problems. Inflation is too high and growth is too weak. And whatever the central bank does, it risks making one of those worse. If it raises rates, it risks pushing the economy into a deeper slowdown. If it cuts rates, it's risking driving inflation higher again. And right now, it's clearly decided that growth is the bigger concern. But that decision comes with consequences, because cutting rates while inflation is still elevated is a very dangerous game. It risks fueling more inflation. It risks weakening the ruble further. Now, we've talked about the ruble a lot, and it's pretty much managed at the moment because nobody else is dealing with it. And it also risks embedding inflation into the system for longer. And this isn't a short-term issue. Russia has already been dealing with elevated inflation for several years now. And over time, that erodes purchasing power, damages consumer confidence, and creates instability. Now, on top of all of this, we also have the global situation, because the ongoing conflict in Iran is now pushing up oil and gas prices and creating broader inflationary pressures across the global economy. And while higher oil prices can theoretically benefit Russia on the revenue side, they also increase costs across the board. Imports become more expensive, supply chains are disrupted, and that feeds directly into domestic inflation in Russia. So what we're likely to see over the next few months is renewed upward pressure on prices, higher inflation, not just globally, but specifically within Russia, which makes this decision to cut interest rates even more questionable, because instead of preparing for higher inflation, the Bank of Russia is effectively adding fuel to the fire. Now, you could argue that this is a short-term strategy. Support growth now, deal with inflation later. But the problem with that approach is that inflation rarely just disappears. Once it starts to rise again, it often requires more aggressive action to bring it back under control. So in reality, what Russia may be doing here is creating a bigger problem for itself further down the line. Short-term relief in exchange for long-term pain. And that's why this is such an important development, because it tells us that the Russian economy is under more pressure than headline numbers suggest. If things were strong, there would be no need to cut interest rates. The fact that they are cutting tells you that something isn't working. And when you combine slowing growth, persistent inflation, currency pressure, and rising global costs, you end up with a very challenging outlook. So the overall summary of today's video is that inflation is still well above target in Russia, growth is slowing sharply, and the Bank of Russia has made a decision to prioritize growth by cutting interest rates. But that decision increases the risk of higher inflation in the months ahead, particularly given what's happening globally with rising energy prices and supply disruptions linked to the war in Iran. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments on this and related stories. Hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. That's what I'm trying to do, provoke some thoughts. If you've liked what I've said, or maybe you didn't like it, but you thought it was interesting, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. Scan the QR code on the screen now, or click the link in the description below if you'd like to get involved in that. Got some really exciting deals on the go at the moment, bit of fun. Thank you also to everyone that's supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, really appreciate that support. Really helps to keep me motivated and making as many videos as possible. So thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face. Ha ha ha!